The heavy oak door of the grand Colonial estate on Walnut Avenue had barely clicked shut behind me when the screaming began. It was a sound that didn't just pierce the air, it seemed to shred the very fabric of the quiet Tuesday afternoon I had tried to construct for myself. I stood in the entryway, clutching my purse against my chest like a shield, while the smell of rain and wet pavement still clung to my wool coat. Before I could even hang up my keys, my daughter Stephanie was there, her face contorted into a mask of unrecognizable rage. Behind her, pacing the living room rug like a panther trapped in a cage far too small, was Bradley. My son-in-law held his smartphone so tight his knuckles were white. The veins in his neck were throbbing, a visible pulse of erratic anger that filled the foyer. They didn't give me a chance to speak, or even take off my rain-soaked shoes. "Are you out of your absolute mind, Mother?" Stephanie screamed. She marched toward me, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor that my late husband Charles and I had refinished 30 years ago. "Do you have any idea what just happened?" Bradley tried to pay the contractor at the hardware store. The card was declined. Declined, Mother, in front of everyone. He almost passed out at the checkout counter from pure embarrassment. Her words ricocheted off the high ceilings, laced with a venom I had grown accustomed to over the last 4 years. Bradley stopped pacing and thrust his phone toward my face. "Where is the money, Leah?" Bradley roared, his voice desperate. "The account shows a zero balance. Zero. Transfer it back right now." I looked at them both. I looked at Stephanie, the girl whose tears I had dried, whose college tuition I had paid for by working double shifts. I looked at Bradley, standing there in a designer sweater I had unknowingly funded. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. I felt a strange sensation wash over me. It wasn't fear. It was a cold, hard clarity, like the surface of a frozen lake. This wasn't a breakdown. It was a balance sheet. I'd been the silent investor in their version of family, and my compassion had been a luxury they had overdrafted monthly. This wasn't revenge. It was accounting. I walked past them, placing my purse on the antique side table with a deliberate calmness that sucked the oxygen right out of the room. The entryway smelled like wet pavement and burning silence. I slowly unbuttoned my wool coat, letting their panic hang in the heavy air. I changed the bank routing numbers. I said, my voice steady, lacking the tremble that had defined my existence in this house for so long. I turned to face them, standing tall despite the arthritis burning in my lower back. This morning, I opened a new account at a different bank. My pension and Social Security now deposit there. It is an account that neither of you has access to, now or ever. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. Stephanie's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Bradley's face turned a sickly, ghostly pale. It was the suspended moment before a car crash, the split second where the inevitable impact is realized but hasn't yet occurred. "What?" Stephanie whispered, the scream dying in her throat, replaced by genuine shock. "You can't do that. You cannot do that. We have bills. We have the mortgage. We have the car payments." "The mortgage?" I repeated, feeling something inside my chest harden into steel. "You mean the mortgage on the vacation home you bought in Hilton Head? Or are you referring to the payments on Bradley's new luxury SUV? Because the mortgage on this house, Stephanie, the one we are standing in, was paid off by your father and me in 1998. Now I realized our relationship had been a subscription, with me footing the bill. The transaction was officially over. Stephanie snapped out of her shock, her voice rising as she frantically listed our expenses. She itemized their country club fees, the maintenance for their luxury vehicle, and the bills for their lifestyle in the Hamptons, listing them off as if they were my moral obligations. She genuinely believed she had a natural right to my legacy. As I watched her lips move, the noise faded, and my mind slipped back through the fog to a cold November morning 4 years ago. My husband Charles's funeral. I remembered the biting wind, the heavy scent of white lilies, and the terrifying, cavernous silence that followed. Charles had been my anchor, a man who saw structure in everything, who made me feel safe in a chaotic world. When his heart stopped on a Tuesday while he was sketching in his study, my world collapsed with him. I was vulnerable, fragile, and desperately lonely. That was when they swooped in. Stephanie sat on the edge of my bed, holding my hand with a tenderness I hadn't seen since she was a child. Bradley flashed his charming smile, promising that if they moved in, they could manage the maintenance of this massive Savannah estate and fill the house with life again. They called it a win-win partnership. I called it a lifeline. Looking back, I see how the trap was laid. It was a slow, insidious erosion of my boundaries, like water dripping on stone. I shrank myself, making my presence smaller and smaller, hoping that if I took up less space, they would love me more. My compliance wasn't weakness, it was the invisible chains of a survivor trying to buy affection in a world that suddenly felt freezing and empty. It was the trauma of grief, a psychological paralysis that forced an educated, former high school principal to tolerate the systemic overriding of her own home. But today, the ledger was perfectly balanced in my mind. They had traded their promised caretaking for absolute parasitism. Over 4 years, they had systematically drained $165,000 of the savings Charles had left behind. They treated my bank account like a credit line with an infinite limit. I remembered the exact afternoon they convinced me to liquidate $45,000 from my reserves to renovate the estate's heritage greenhouse. Stephanie had smiled, claiming it was an investment to increase the property value for my benefit. Instead, the moment the structure was finalized, Bradley turned it into his private corporate entertainment lounge. I was barred from even stepping inside unless I was cleaning up the empty glasses and expensive catering containers left behind by his polished friends. They had taken my heritage, my home, and my peace, and recycled them into props for their shallow status. And yet, Stephanie stood before me, completely unrepentant, demanding that the cash cow continue to produce. Bradley's face twisted into an expression of pure, unadulterated malice. Stripped of his financial leverage, his civilized executive facade cracked completely. He lunged sideways, his fist slamming violently against the plaster wall right next to the antique mahogany coat rack. The heavy thud vibrated through the old floorboards, and a framed photograph of Charles and me tilted drastically askew, the glass rattling inside the frame. "You are a senile, ungrateful old woman," he hissed. Stepping so close, I could feel the aggressive heat radiating from his posture. "Without us, you would be rotting alone in some state facility. Nobody cares about you. You need us to survive, and this is how you treat the people keeping you alive? You are completely dependent on us, Leah." Stephanie didn't stop him. She didn't even blink at the sudden violence of his gesture. Instead, she weaponized her own calculated malice, pulling out her phone with a cruel, steady hand. "If you don't reverse this transfer right now, Mother, I am going public," she threatened, her green eyes narrowing into slits. "I will post everything. I will tell our entire social circle, the neighbors, and your former academic colleagues that you are suffering from a severe, paranoid episode. By tomorrow morning, everyone in Savannah will know that the great former principal has lost her mind and is actively destroying her family's life. We will have you legally declared incompetent." I stood there, watching them thrash, and suddenly a profound clarity hit me. This was the absolute zenith of their psychological warfare. This was the trap of ruthless normalization. Narcissists possess a terrifying ability to rewrite reality until your survival funds become their birthright. For 4 years, they had slowly conditioned me to believe that my pension, my savings, and my ancestral space were resources meant to be mined for their comfort. They didn't see themselves as thieves. They truly believed they earned every single dollar by simply allowing me to exist in their proximity. When a parasite's food supply is cut off, it doesn't apologize. It rages against the host for daring to reclaim its own life force. They had normalized their cruelty so deeply that my sudden boundary felt to them like an act of unpardonable aggression. 6 months ago, their threats would have hollowed me out. I would have retreated to my room, weeping into my pillow, terrified of the isolation they promised. But their words were nothing but empty noise now. They were the desperate thrashing of a parasite realizing the host was no longer compliant. Just as Bradley opened his mouth to deliver another insult, the heavy brass lock on the front door turned. The heavy oak door swung open, and the freezing, damp Savannah air rushed into the stifling foyer. Standing on the threshold was Olivia. My granddaughter didn't look like an ally they could manipulate. She carried herself with the precise, freezing authority of an elite corporate litigator from Boston. Dressed in a sharp, rain-slicked trench coat, she stepped inside, shaking her wet umbrella with a clinical movement that immediately cut through the manic energy of the room. She didn't look at her mother, and she didn't offer a polite greeting to Bradley. Under her arm, she held a thick, certified manila folder. The corporate enforcement had arrived, and the dynamic of this house was about to be completely rewritten. Olivia walked straight past my daughter and son-in-law, her heels snapping against the floor with a rhythmic precision that sounded like a countdown. She set her briefcase on the mahogany coffee table, popped the metal latches open with a sharp click, and pulled out a stack of certified legal documents. Stephanie tried to step forward, her face morphing into a mask of maternal offense. Olivia, what is the meaning of this? This is a private family conversation. Your grandmother has had a paranoid breakdown. Olivia didn't even look up. Sit down, Mom. You too, Bradley, she said, her voice dropping into a low, terrifyingly calm register. Bradley tried to puff out his chest to assert some desperate dominance. Now listen here, young lady, you don't come into this house. I said sit down, Bradley. Olivia cut him off. Her eyes held the exact same unyielding steel that my late husband Charles used to possess when a structure was fundamentally unsound. Bradley's mouth closed instantly, and he sank back onto the sofa, his false confidence evaporating. Olivia slid the first set of certified papers across the table. This isn't a family dispute anymore. This is a criminal master file, she stated flatly. I spent the last 48 hours with forensic accountants and the fraud division. Let's start with the American Express Centurion line, opened secretly under false pretenses, a premium account under the name Leah Sterling. Except my grandmother never signed this application. You did, Bradley. You forged her signature, ran up a fraudulent balance of $32,000 for a luxury trip and high-end electronics, and directed the statements to a hidden post office box. Bradley's face instantly drained of whatever color it had left, turning a sickly, hollow white as he stared at the undeniable signature analysis. But that's just the prelude, Olivia continued, her voice growing colder, sharper, and utterly lethal. She pulled a secondary stack of printed digital transcripts from her folder. This is the coup de grace. I accessed the data logs from your shared tablet during the asset discovery phase. This is an encrypted email thread between the two of you and a commercial real estate development firm downtown. The room became entirely frozen. I stood perfectly still by the wainscoting, watching my own daughter look at the papers as if they were a death warrant. Olivia read the calloused, printed words aloud. Stephanie and Bradley had been in active, secret negotiations for months to sell this entire ancestral Savannah estate to commercial developers the exact moment I passed away. But the true moral decay was laid bare in the final paragraphs. They had systematically intercepted my hospital mail, quietly canceling my pre-op consultations and intentionally withholding the insurance co-payments required for my upcoming critical heart surgery, all to freeze the remaining capital for their planned relocation to California. The betrayal didn't break my heart this time. It simply turned whatever maternal warmth I had left into absolute stone. This was no longer a civil disagreement over household bills. It was an ironclad, multi-count felony investigation involving elder, financial abuse, identity theft, and grand larceny. Looking at the vipers sitting on my sofa, I realized they had completely erased any remaining path to redemption. They were documented criminals who had actively calculated the cost of my death. Bradley collapsed backward onto the sofa, the air leaving his lungs in a sharp, pathetic gasp. The aggressive, dominant posture vanished instantly, replaced by a raw, naked terror. His hands shook so violently he dropped his smartphone onto the rug. Stephanie slid completely off the velvet ottoman, dropping to her knees on the cold hardwood floor. The arrogant, pristine mask she had worn for years was entirely gone. She reached out, trying to grab the hem of my trousers, her fingers trembling as she wept frantic tears. She wasn't begging for forgiveness, she was begging for her social standing. She implored me to think about the family name, her reputation, and the absolute humiliation of what people would say. She wailed that a public indictment would permanently destroy their futures. I stood perfectly straight, looking down at my biological daughter from a physical and moral altitude that rendered her screaming insignificant. I refused to absorb her manufactured guilt. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon a shred of regret or maternal panic, but there was only clarity. This wasn't a family crisis. It was a liquidation of bad debt. They weren't crying because they had calculated my death or broken my heart. They were crying because their primary financial engine had shut down. They weren't shocked by their own criminal fraud. They were shocked that I had stopped playing the victim. The emotional credit line they had abused for years was permanently revoked, and the transaction was closed for good. Olivia didn't offer a single moment of leniency. She turned and tapped the glass window facing the front driveway, pointing toward the street. She explained with an architectural precision that Bradley's luxury sport utility vehicle had been fraudulently collateralized against a hidden trust account Charles had left behind for my long-term care. Using a technical asset recovery loophole, Olivia had already authorized an enforcement team. Outside, the heavy, low whine of a repossession truck filled the damp air, its flashing amber lights reflecting rhythmically against the portrait of Charles. They were impounding his prized possession right before his eyes, stripping him of his rented status. Olivia placed a fresh document on the table along with a heavy black pen. I stepped forward, my voice absolute and stripped of all maternal hesitation. I delivered the final finisher. I gave them exactly 60 seconds to choose between two options. Option A was an immediate police escort off the property for criminal trespassing, coupled with an emergency court injunction to freeze every single one of their remaining personal bank accounts by tomorrow morning. Option B was signing this unyielding, court-admissible confession and structured restitution agreement, wiring $450 monthly until the baseline of stolen capital and unauthorized credit debt was repaid in full. Bradley snatched the pen with ruined fingers, signing his name in shaky, broken strokes. Stephanie followed, her expensive foundation smeared with tears as she finalized her own financial indictment. The next 2 hours were a quiet, systematic eviction. I watched them pack their lives into cardboard boxes, moving like ghosts through the grand Colonial hallways they had tried to steal. They walked out of my house, their steps heavy with the sudden weight of the real world. As they drove away into the cold Savannah dusk, their taillights fading into the gray mist, the lock on the ancestral vault clicked shut for good. A soft, seasonal shift occurred as winter settled over Savannah, but inside the estate, a deep, clean warmth had finally returned. The silence was no longer a hollow, haunting void. It was a pristine canvas waiting for me to rewrite my own existence. The very first thing I did was paint the kitchen, a bright, sunny yellow, a color Stephanie had always claimed was far too common for a house of our social status. I returned to my volunteer work at the library, reconnected with the book club friends I had been forced to abandon, and spent my mornings gardening in the front yard. For the first time in 4 years, the ancestral vault was locked, and my soul was at peace within its boundaries. 9 months passed before the final test arrived on a crisp autumn afternoon. A beat-up, anonymous sedan pulled up to the curb, and Stephanie stepped out. The expensive foundation, the pristine manicured hands, and the designer silk were completely gone, replaced by a faded sweater and the exhausted eyes of a dental receptionist who now takes the city bus every single day. She walked up the driveway slowly, her posture entirely diminished. Bradley had left her for a younger woman with an actual trust fund, and she was now drowning in the reality of a tiny studio apartment in the city. She stood on my porch, weeping real, quiet tears of humility, admitting how greed had eaten her alive before begging if she could come inside for a glass of water to talk about fixing the past. I looked at my daughter, feeling the enduring ache of a mother's love, but my adherence to my own sovereignty was unshakable. This was the definitive lesson of an illusion of power from an empty vault. I realized that the grand status Stephanie and Bradley had projected was never a reflection of their own character. It was a temporary mask rented entirely with my stolen dignity and Charles's capital. Once the ancestral vault was locked, the architecture of their arrogance crumbled, exposing parasites who had never learned how to survive on their own merit. I looked Stephanie in the eye, maintaining a calm, gentle precision. "Not today, Stephanie," I said softly. "I am not ready for that today. Perhaps in a few months, when you have sent a few more monthly $450 checks to prove you are here for my heart and not just for a roof to shelter you." I gently closed the heavy oak door and turned the deadbolt, locking out the manipulation permanently. Through this painful journey, I've come to realize that we teach the world exactly how to treat us. If you continuously shrink your own boundaries, hoping to buy the affection of those who only value us as an economic resource to be harvested, you become complicit in your own destruction. If you find yourself in a similar situation, remember that forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it's the only way to set yourself free. But forgiveness does not mandate a return to proximity, nor does it require you to hand the weapon back to someone who spent years trying to bleed you dry. Self-respect is a legacy that cannot be collateralized by the entitlement of others. If this journey of unyielding self-respect opened your eyes to the power of personal boundaries, click that share button right now. Don't forget to subscribe and let me know in the comments below. Have you ever had to permanently lock the vault on someone to save your own soul? Let's build our community together.